So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rena, and she is going to be delivering her presentation. Thanks, Rena.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rena Kuwahata. Thank you for the introduction. I'm an energy analyst for power system transformation at the International Energy Agency. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers and hosts, GridX, for having me here today. The International Energy Agency launched a global report on electricity grids almost 1 month ago now, to put a spotlight on the invisible giant for policymakers. The report highlights the importance of grids to enable secure energy transitions. As the demand for it grows, clean electricity becomes the pillar of society and economic activity. It's the job of grids to deliver the clean electricity in a secure and affordable way and maintain a resilient power system. Without heightened attention, we see a risk that electricity grids may become the weak link in the clean energy transitions. And this is what we uncover on a global scale in this report. The status of the grids today, the symptoms of it not keeping pace with the clean energy transition, and the gap that needs to be filled quickly by 2030, 2040, 50, and so on. We also quantify the cost to society if action is delayed. And finally, we provide some key recommendations for policymakers on the points that need their intervention. Today, we're facing a change in the nature of our electricity systems, both in demand and supply, which will have consequences on both transmission and distribution grids. On the one hand, we are seeing significant change in demand for electricity. This is driven by economic growth, but also electrification of space heating and cooling, uptake of electric vehicles, and the use of electrolyzers for producing hydrogen. Energy efficiency will reduce overall consumption, but the share of electricity as an energy source will increase from 20% today to more than half of the total final consumption by 2050. And what this highlights is that electricity will take center stage. As electricity becomes the pillar of society, electricity security comes into the spotlight as well. All this growing electricity demand will be supplied by a generation mix that looks different to today. Fossil fuel generation is being phased out and cleaner sources are scaling up. In Europe, we expect wind and solar PV to make up 50% of electricity supply by 2050. And globally, 80% of new generation capacity will be wind and solar PV. This has implications for the way supply and demand is balanced and essential grid services are sourced. As you see here from the chart on the right, today, thermal and hydropower plants provide system flexibility, which is needed to cover demand variability and uncertainty. But in the future, we expect a transition here, that additional flexibility will be needed to complement the variability of solar PV, and it will be predominantly sourced from batteries and demand-side measures. This chart can be quite scary for power system operators. Significant changes are needed in procurement mechanisms for flexibility. But above all, grids need to be fit for purpose. They need to be ready for these new flexibility sources to perform. One of the reasons why we're ringing alarm bells, so to say, at the moment is this. If there's no doubt that power systems play an increasingly important role in the economy, it follows that we need significant investment in infrastructure, not only in generation, but on the transmission and distribution that will bring this electricity to homes, businesses, and industry. However, when we look at the recent rates of investment in energy sector, one may doubt whether there's really enough attention. Globally, there is $300 billion per year on average that's been invested in grids, including both transmission and distribution. Half of this is in advanced economies, which saw a modest increase in the last 5 years of 5%, and 1/4 of this is in China, and the remainder in emerging and developing economies. The worrying trend is that investment in emerging and developing economies has shrunk by 7% in the last 5 years. There's no hard evidence that these rates will dramatically change upward either. We've checked public announcements by governments and industry in terms of expected investment in coming decades, and in most cases, the commitments are vague and falling significantly short of what is needed. And this is in strong contrast to the clear statements of commitment to support the accelerated growth of renewables and end-use electrification. The invisible giant, the grids, is slow moving, and it seems to be causing bottlenecks already. The slow pace of progress in grid investment means that today, numerous solar PV and wind projects are waiting for grid connection. Our analysis shows that at least 1,500 gigawatts of renewable energy projects in advanced stages are in connection queues today. As a reference, this is 5 times the amount of wind and solar PV capacity that was added last year. Our analysis collected all the accessible information from around the world, published and held by relevant organizations, but the available information covers markets that account for only 50% of installed capacity of the world. So this number, 1,500 gigawatts, could be significantly higher, in fact. A point to be made here, improving the data transparency for these connection queues in all markets would be an important step to help correctly diagnose problems and address them. So a key reason for the enlarged connection queue is that while investments for wind and solar PV have almost doubled in the last 10 years, investment in grids has remained stagnant. And as countries accelerate the permitting of new renewable energy projects, grids will need to keep up to avoid risking an increase in this waiting queue. There are other signs of bottlenecks. In Europe, many countries talk about congestion and curtailment as indicators for bottlenecks. And while some amount of congestion and curtailment might be economically optimal when put against the cost of building new transmission capacity, unaddressed structural bottlenecks simply cause operational costs to rise. And the costs are not insignificant, in some cases reaching billions of dollars and euros in certain countries that you can see here. If grids remain the weak link and not an enabler, it would also erode electricity security, raising the likelihood of electricity outages, which are extremely expensive to everyone and already cost the global economy $100 billion per year today. And this is equivalent to around 0.1% of global GDP. These here are results of different social impacts of outages caused by vulnerability of the grid, as opposed to a fuel shortage or a breakdown of a generator causing interruptions to power supply. So here you can see already today, in some countries like the United States, Australia, and China, outages caused by the grid result in economic impacts in the order of 0.15 to 0.2% of its GDP. If we are to meet the announced policy targets worldwide, we need to accelerate the deployment and transformation of our grids. Putting it in numbers here, over the last 20 years, grids grew by more than 25 million kilometers worldwide. But over the next 2 decades, they need to expand twice as much to create the links between new electricity demand, new power plants, and new sources of flexibility. In addition, 30 million kilometers of grids will need to be replaced and modernized due to old age. In total, close to 80 million kilometers needs to be added or replaced by 2040. And that's equivalent to the lengths of grids we have in existence today, which was built over a century. So it's not an ordinary business as usual situation. To accelerate grid development, policy intervention is needed to channel investment. Grid investment needs to double by 2030 from around $300 billion to over $600 billion in the future. This would break a decade of stagnation of grid investment at the global level and put it in lockstep with the rising investment of renewables. When we look at a regional breakdown of the kilometers needed, we can get an impression of the gaps and the efforts needed by the different regions. Here, first, very striking is that efforts are required across the globe. No region is spared. Even China, where they have made a good headway, they need to step up on the pace. Second, it will happen all at the same time. In Europe, the length of grids need to grow 40% by 2050 compared to the level today. But in other regions, including China, India, and emerging and developing economies, they are faced with even steeper increases. This will create unprecedented competition for sourcing grid components, but also need to step up construction capacity to deploy them. Taking a look at supply chains, accelerating grid development would also raise material needs. For transmission and distribution lines, the amount of aluminium needed each year would increase by over 50% by the 2030s, and copper demand for grids would double, along with rising demand for other niche products like electrical steel. Picking up the pace of grid development is not just about investment. It requires scaling up the entire supply chain, including raising how much material is needed each year and the capacity to manufacture the grid components at scale and pace needed. Accelerating grid expansion is easier said than done, as the process can be complex, involving many stakeholders, and can take many years. Considering the example of planning a power system for the year 2035, a dozen of years in the future from now, when do decisions need to be taken for different parts of the system? For grids, that decision window can be very soon. Extra high voltage transmission can take a decade or more to develop. This means the decision time for a typical project is approaching or already here. For high voltage transmission, decisions need to be taken by 2030 in many cases, while distribution lines are faster to develop. In advanced economies, the development times tend to be longer and can stretch over a decade, in part due to the complexity of regulation, difficulty in finding rights of way, and political concerns. Much can be done by streamlining steps in process while maintaining robust public consultation and engagement. In other economies like India, development times for transmission would still mean that a decision needs to be taken prior to 2030 for the project to finish by 2035. China has been able to develop projects faster than in Europe, but would also benefit from further development. These long lead times are especially challenging when compared to how quickly renewables can be built and how fast electrification can grow. For example, wind power can be developed in under 4 years in most cases, and solar projects in less, even under 1 year. Electric vehicle charging hubs can be deployed in just a couple of years. That means decisions for those technologies can be taken in 2030s and completed by 2035. So in comparison to that, the importance on starting grid planning now and developing those projects now is really critical. And this is a key point to explain why electricity grids require advanced planning to stay ahead of the curve and make sure that they enable the clean energy transitions. If grid development and investment doesn't accelerate to the extent needed, what will happen? We explored some of the potential risks through analysis of a grid delay case, as we called it. So delaying investment in grids can set back the uptake of renewables, and this would lead to higher fossil fuel use and CO2 emissions in the long term. This would mean higher import bills, which could amount to more than an additional $500 billion US, as well as 2.5 times increase in the power sector CO2 emissions in 2050. With this trajectory, the red trajectory, there would be a 40% chance of global temperature rise exceeding 2 degrees in the year 2100, compared with a median of 1.7 degrees Celsius which is the baseline in our modeling for this scenario on the blue line. So the key message is, yes, we need more grids. We need a step change in pace of investment and deployment. But we also need these grids to be smart. Investment in digital technologies, in the way of smart meters, automation, communication devices, electric vehicle charging, and data analytics have been increasing in recent years. These technologies enable resources to be visible and a higher granularity than today. With the information about the type of resource, its availability, and in time, this can help make better decisions about how to optimize the operation of our power systems. Coupling this with controllability, either by the grid operator, third-party aggregator, or the consumer themselves, resources can be managed more effectively with processes and market mechanisms. So we all want to avoid this scenario, the grid delay scenario, where we fail to pay enough attention to grids and let it become a barrier to the energy transition. We, and at least me, I would like to be a powerful enabler instead. So for this, action needs to take place today, and our report provides 6 main areas where effort should be focused. First, we need to bring planning up to date. It needs to be strategic and integrated across sectors to correctly capture synergies that exist. Given the lead times for new grid projects, a forward-looking approach is essential. Second, investment needs to be unlocked globally. The European Commission is a relatively good example here, where it continues efforts to ensure policy support and drive targeted funding for grids. Globally, though, improving the way how grid companies are remunerated will be important. And additionally, investment in emerging markets and developing economies will require particular focus to address cost of capital issues. Third, the regulatory framework needs to be fit for purpose. Today, grid development needs to take place proactively and not reactively. It should allow anticipatory investments. We need to ensure grids are there when they're needed. Streamlining administrative procedures to reduce lead times and bringing grids to the center of the public narrative of the clean energy transitions. Fourth, supply chains need to be ready to deliver the material and components required. For this, establishing clear pipelines of grid projects will enable the development of resilient supply chains. Fifth, leverage digitalization. Digitalization of transmission and distribution grids needs to be expanded to support efficiency and security, enabling better use of automation and artificial intelligence. And finally, sixth, there is already a significant need for a high number of skilled professionals across the entire supply chain, as well as in system operators and regulatory institutions. Building out a pool of talent is essential, as is ensuring digital skills are integrated into power industry curricula. That's it with my presentation. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Rena. Very insightful presentation there, and a lot to unpack. So now we do have a bit of time for a Q&A. We've already had some questions coming through in the chat, but please, audience members, feel free to ask more questions to Rena and dive more into this flagship report. It's a really awesome opportunity to ask questions. So Rena, we've already had one question from the audience. Someone has asked, solar PV is perfect for decentralized electrification because there's almost no grid expansion needed. Why not emphasize this clear advantage?
Thank you for that comment. And I do, sorry, I hear a little bit of an echo on my side, but I think it's gone now. Thanks. I think some of the figures that I showed emphasized the fact that due to the cost advantages of solar PV, that the expectation is that in the future, there will be significant growth of power supplied from this technology. So in terms of recognizing the advantage of electricity supplied from solar PV, this is definitely something to take advantage of. In terms of that technology, then therefore avoiding the need for grid capacity increase, We haven't explored in detail in our report with our modeling capability to quantify the impact really. But depending on the time of the day, you have to make sure that the consumption is matched when the power is supplied or the energy is produced from solar PV. So unless that is really the case, and also at the decentralized level, there will be periods when there is a surplus, which then will require the electricity generated from the distributed solar PV to flow somewhere else, not just be consumed locally, and vice versa in the periods where there is little solar PV output, like in the evenings, then to compensate, it has to come from somewhere else as well to supply the local demand. So perhaps it could be a little bit, there would be an impact, positive impact that you can assume for a decentralized solution, but it doesn't directly translate to, therefore you don't need any reinforcement or you don't need to build new grids. This is not really the case. Yeah.
Thanks, Rena. And we've had another question. It might out of your expertise, so you might be able to make it a little bit more power systems focused, but someone has asked, is there an estimate on how much more energy, kilowatt hours, will be needed for a 100% EV world? But I guess you could go more specifically, what do we need in transmission and distribution grids to cater specifically to EVs?
Well, we haven't quantified that either, so I cannot give you any numbers. But I mean, it's intuitive, I guess, to say that if you have more electric vehicles that are typically replacing private vehicles, transportation means, then the points of charging or where that electricity will be consumed will be in the distribution grids. That means that there's an additional consumption based on compared to what there is already today, which implies that we need to have more capacity to deliver electricity to power those electric vehicles. So no doubt there will be a significant impact on distribution grids. In some jurisdictions, this has already been felt, and being able to predict and forecast, I guess, in the planning of distribution grids, in which areas they should expect the growth of electricity consumption by EVs, at what pace, is something that they're struggling with. And whether this then impacts also transmission grids, I think that's very much anticipated, because, of course, the paradigm today is still very largely dependent on centralized power plants delivering through the transmission grid down to the distribution grid, which then serve the loads. So as long as this structure is predominantly the case, then of course the more you need to have, the more consumption you expect in the distribution grid, the more it will draw from the transmission grid, and therefore it'll have impact on the transmission grid. So this coordination between distribution and transmission grid in terms of planning, in terms of managing the load and supply balance will be critical.
And when you say this coordination, do you mean coordination between stakeholders, or kind of physically between the grids, or using technology? What's involved in that coordination?
I would say it's a little bit of all of those things you mentioned. I mean, one thing for sure is the planning dimension of it. So as I mentioned, for distribution systems, there is a need to improve, I suppose, or keep up to date with the changing landscape of demand, to make sure that they're able to plan ahead of time, proactively and not reactively, as I said. The need for more increased capacity. So that could be more cables, more lines, but also bigger transformers and so on, and the substations. And there, when you have the interface between the distribution grid and the transmission grid in forms of the substations, there it has to be coordinated between those two planners, I guess, or asset owners to coordinate the build-up of the physical technology and so on capabilities. But beyond that, of course, on a day-to-day management of load and supply balance, and how to manage the power flows, how to manage the system balance, and how distributed resources are impacting system balance. There, it's more about the processes. How do you have visibility of the different behaviors of those components? How do you then make sure that the visibility is taken into account in the procedures of operating the grids in a safe way? So the business of grid operators is exactly that, to make sure that grids operate in a safe way. But they have processes and procedures for that. These new elements have to be taken also into account, and their coordination will be needed between the processes that DSOs have, or distribution grid operators have, the process that transmission system operators have. So both for planning, for infrastructure build out, technology selection, but also for the operational processes.
Very interesting. Thanks, Rena. And we've had another question from the audience commenting that they assume the grids analysis includes interregional interconnectors as well. And then they've asked, if so, do you have any idea of which countries have the chance to become net exporters of clean energy if interconnectors are expanded? Quite a specific question there. I'm not sure if that's covered in the report.
Right. Indeed, it's not explicitly mentioned in the report. Within the modeling that we do, to some extent, that is considered, but it's not at a high enough granularity to be able to say anything about the final position of a single country, essentially, whether they would end up being a net importer or a net exporter. I have seen other studies that do that, but it's not the purpose, I guess, of the modeling that we've done for the electricity grids report, and also the modeling wasn't geared towards being able to draw any conclusions about that.
Okay, thanks. And someone has asked, you mentioned the increasing role of demand response. Can you give a bit more detail of what is expected in terms of flexibility from demand sectors?
Right, thanks for that interesting question. So there, as you have noticed also from that figure, that the supply of the flexibility is shifting away from, expected to shift away from thermal and hydro towards demand response. Well, hydro might stay, but demand response and batteries largely. But the driver side also was changing. So the driver today is mainly the variability and uncertainty in demand. So it's very difficult to forecast that with high accuracy demand. But in the future, on top of this, the solar PV variability. So the fact that in the evenings there's no power, and then during the day there might be more power than needed. This is the thing that needs to be balanced by flexibility based on batteries and demand. So there you could imagine, when there is during the day a lot of production, so potentially surplus, you want to increase your consumption by demand and turning on the batteries to absorb that. And then in other periods where there might not be enough, well, hopefully there's enough, but in periods where there's an event and then you need to suddenly, I guess, and at a short amount of time, adjust the demand, there should be mechanisms to reduce demand. Not hopefully, right? Today, this is done often as a last resort measure with very little warning to the customers, and that was unplanned. But in the future, hopefully, this can be in a mechanisms where people are aware when this might happen, and then they make a conscious decision in order to, as a response, I guess, from the system needs, to change their behavior in terms of reduction of the demand, and that way even maybe be remunerated for that positive behavior. So it's in both directions. So to increase the consumption at sometimes and decrease the consumption at sometimes when the system needs it, and hopefully by then there are mechanisms in place that this can be done in a way that is with more certainty, I guess, for the consumer who is the one providing that service.
Thanks, Rena. And kind of expanding on that, you also talked about this a little bit in your presentation, talking about how we need to make grids smart. Someone has asked a bit more specifically, do you see a chance in reducing grid expansions by increasing capabilities of managing flexibility within the grids, such as replacing physical grid assets with digital intelligence?
Thanks for that question as well. I mean, that is indeed digitalization encompasses a lot of concepts. So there you throw a word at it and it sort of captures everything. So I think I tried to illustrate a bit more clarity there. It doesn't matter whether it's a behind the meter behavioral change that the digital technology enables, or something directly on a grid asset of the transformer to make it more efficient, or a power line, etc. Could also be something within the grid operator system in a software, which helps them make faster decisions or more optimal decisions, and so on. There's different technologies and solutions associated with the digitalization. I think what is important from a power system perspective, in terms of leveraging that to make the whole power system more efficient, as between the need to build out and the way to manage the available assets as they are, right? The existing grid, use full capacity versus building new grid, is really giving the system operators the capability to optimize the operation. So for that, you really need to have visibility of the system. So any kind of technology solution that gives more visibility provides the data, and anything that helps them analyze the data in a way that can be used to improve the operation is critical. And then once you have that information, you need to be able to act based on that information. So controllability is also important. These are the key components, right? Observability and controllability, and the data analysis for giving insights to help you make good decisions. These are the key components that enable digitalization to be really effective.
Thanks, Rena. And continuing on the flexibility topic, someone has asked, for better grid infrastructure, more flexibility is required. How do you control for that in your analyses? And how do you see the development and its effects?
I'm not 100% sure if I understood the question. In the modeling that we have done, which is out to 2050, we do consider system variabilities on an hour-by-hour sort of resolution. So the flexibility needs also assessed on that resolution. There could be room for improvement, of course, in terms of frequency stability and voltage stability and other dynamic things, if you're an engineer. But for a global scale analysis, this is not what we are doing at the moment. But an hourly consideration of the variability, and therefore the flexibility needs, is quite already a good indication, essentially, of the scale of flexibility that we needed. And so, as I already explained, I guess, also after the presentation, the main drivers for flexibility, it'll remain the demand variability, but also on top of that, solar PV and some of the wind, I guess, to cater for, or to be complementary with the variability that will be coming into the system based on those technologies. And then where the flexibility will come from, as we just discussed, right? It's not only going to be from thermal units as it has been in the past, but we have a large expectation on demand side participating in that, and battery storage to play a role.
Nice, thank you, Rena. And I just want to own in on one of your slides that you showed in your presentation. You showed the annual transmission grid congestion costs in a few different countries, and it showed the US really skyrocketing from 2019 to 2022. What can we learn from this, and what caused this huge spike?
Right. I'm not sure if it was a spike and then it came down as such, but definitely the scale is different to what you see in Europe. So the key difference between Europe and the US is in the electricity market design, I guess. So in Europe, there is a mostly strong support for having uniform electricity prices within a country or within a bidding zone, right? Whereas in the US, they have what is called nodal pricing. So every node, the starting end and the start at the, and the end of a transmission link, more or less, has a different pricing zone, price node, which means that the congestion on every single element is very explicitly valued in the US. So the data that's available for analyzing the cost of congestion is basically on an hour-to-hour basis available, and this is compiled and analyzed in the report in that chart. In Europe, it's a little bit different the way that's handled then, because, for example, in Germany, which was on the chart as well, all of Germany, regardless of where you live, in the north or in the south, the electricity price is uniform. And to resolve congestions, then the TSOs have to implement certain measures, and then they have to put a cost to that measure. So some costs, they might even say, oh, it didn't cost anything, even though there was some person who had to make an effort. So some resources were consumed, but it wasn't explicitly, there was no explicit cost allocation or associated with that action. So it's the visible component of the cost of congestion for Europe, which was in the chart. And when you put it on the same chart, then it looks quite different. But if, for example, if we had a nodal pricing system in Europe, maybe the charts would look slightly different, right? And then another point to say is that some other countries, which were not even appearing in that chart, we knew from dialogue that they do experience congestion and they have to put in place congestion management measures, but they really don't have any mechanisms in place for compensation or explicitly recovering those costs from through grid tariffs. So there's no way to monitor or report those costs. So again, it's a little bit difficult to have a worldwide comparison of that measure, because the way congestion is defined and the way the costs are accounted for are different. And so here, that could explain some of the differences why in the US it looks a lot higher than in Europe.
Thanks for that very clear explanation. And on the same slide, you showed the variable renewable energy share in 3 countries versus the curtailment share. And I found it interesting that although the variable renewable energy share kind of steadily increased, the curtailment didn't follow the same pattern. And even in China, it actually went down. What is the key takeaway from this, and what did maybe China do correctly?
Right. That's right. So I guess if there is the conception that the more you have renewables, the more curtailment you have, in a way it's a misconception. That's what the figure shows. The key reasons for at some point in time, even though renewables were at the same level or increasing, the curtailment reduced, was because they made investment in grids. That's a short story. But so there's a link between those different elements, right? The amount of new generation, what type of generation is it, where is it going in the system, versus how ready, I guess, or how well are they integrated? How ready is the grid? How well is it integrated into the grid? This component as well then has a large impact on the curtailment that's needed in the end.
Okay, and final question, and one of your key statements at the end of, call to action plans was about investment. Where is this investment coming from? Do we need to shift investment away from something else towards grids, or what are some kind of key things there?
Right. So of course that's where that's the reason, I guess, why we are calling action for governments and policymakers to be able to make those decisions. One of the points that I made is that we observe a lot more attention and structure and efforts to channel investment in renewables, which is great. It's needed and more is needed. But at the same time, we need to pay attention, just as much attention on the grids. Otherwise, there will be difficult consequences to deal with. So this is the point that we are making, because it seems that, as I mentioned, the invisible giant electricity grid somehow is assumed to be okay on its own without the policy attention. But what we have seen is that's not really the case. Without dedicated attention on grids as well, there's no indication that it will step up to what's required and suddenly increase at the pace required. In terms of where from what other sector should we steal the money from? That, as I said, that's up to the policy makers to decide. But maybe one thing that could be said, and that was discussed also in the report, the way that grid operators, I guess, or grid asset owners are encouraged to make investments today seem to be quite restrictive and focusing heavily on cost optimization. And so this is great, because as electricity consumers who pay the tariffs, we don't want to be paying more than what is necessary. But if it comes at the cost or, at the expense of achieving our clean energy transitions, maybe there should be some more leeway in allowing them to make anticipatory investments, to encourage them to spend money faster, more or less. And also for some jurisdictions, it could be also interesting to explore private sector participation in investing in grids as well. So a little bit more detail about that topic is also explained in the report.
Thank you so much, Rena. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today, but super insightful discussion and keynote presentation there, and a really nice way to kick off our gridXdays for this year. So thank you so much for your time, and I would encourage everyone to, for further insights, to go read the report on power grids from the IEA. Thanks, Rena.